welcome to our audience as they're still coming in, but good evening. We're so pleased to be partnering with the Buffalo Public Library on this Moving Words Writers Across Minnesota event, featuring the talents of Cary Griffith, Sue Leaf, and Jonathan Slaght. I'm Wendy Worden, Programs and Services Assistant at the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library, which is the Library of Congress, Minnesota designated center for the book. As we get started this evening, we would like to take a moment to acknowledge the Dakota people, indigenous keepers of the land from which I'm broadcasting tonight. This land was reserved by the Dakota in the Treaty of Traverse des Sioux, signed with the United States in 1851, and it remains sacred to them today. We also want to acknowledge the Ojibwe people as fellow indigenous inhabitants of this land. Dakota and Ojibwe people are also the original stewards of stories in this place now called Minnesota. And we at the Friends honor that tradition and the knowledge and values embedded in it as we work to lift up storytellers in our state today. The Friends has coordinated the year-long Minnesota Book Awards program for 14 years, and as Minnesota's Center for the Book, we produce programming that benefits all ages and reaches all corners of the state. We are grateful for the generosity of each writer who chooses to share their personal stories, and we respect what they choose to share, as we appreciate our audience's desire to learn from writers and their experiences. For our main event this evening is brought to you in part by the state of Minnesota through a grant to the Minnesota Department of Education, and additional support is provided by the Harlan Boss Foundation for the Arts and Education Minnesota. To start things off this evening, we'll have a brief reading and presentation from each author, and you can pop questions in the chat at any time, and I'll relay them to our authors in the second half of tonight's event. So to start things off this evening, I will welcome Cary Griffith. Cary has one of my favorite bio lines. He says his writing covers the borderlands between wild places and civilization, and he writes both nonfiction and fiction, and he's going to share from his latest work this evening. Welcome, Cary.
Thank you, Wendy, and thank you everybody for queuing in, and a big thanks to my fellow writers tonight. I'm a huge advocate of the Friends, and a lot of people don't know this about me, but after I got a bachelor's in English, I got a master's in library science. So I'm a big advocate of libraries, and they're extremely important. And I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to everyone tonight. And I'm very grateful for the opportunity. So thanks a lot. Tonight, as Wendy mentioned, I write both fiction and nonfiction. And as I thought it might be a good counterpoint to the other two presenters tonight, if I talked a little bit about the fiction. It is the latest book that I've published. It's a novel called, it's a mystery novel, really more of a thriller, called Wolf Kill. And what I thought I'd do is read briefly from the beginning, introduce it a little bit, and then read briefly from the beginning of the second chapter, in which I introduce the main character, my main protagonist, Sam Rivers. I am writing 4 of these. The next one will be published next spring, called Cougar Claw. After that will be Killing Monarchs, and then Dead Catch. So 4 of these will be coming out, and this is the first one. So I'm going to read from chapter 1, and a common trope among mystery writers is that you usually begin with a dead body, and that's what I've begun with here. And I'll read to the point where I get to the body. The farmhouse stood 12 miles outside Defiance, Minnesota, at least as the common raven flew. The house was a compact 2-story peaked square with peeling clappered sides and a tar paper roof. Behind the house, a stand of red pines marked a short ridge in the start of wilderness that stretched 20-odd miles to the Canadian border. To the right of the house was a barn where 3 feeder calves huddled, protected against stray wolves in the deep cold. The field beyond the barn lay blanketed in fresh snow. It was January 26, one of the coldest nights of the year. Sheriff Dean Goddard and Deputy Smith Barnes turned into Williston Winthrop's farmhouse drive. The house was lit up like a Chinese lantern. The drive was long and narrow, and they pulled up and parked behind 2 trucks, an SUV, and Bill Hines' patrol car. Looks like a damn party, Barnes commented. That it does, Goddard agreed. As they got out of their cruiser, Hines opened the farmhouse door, stepping into the cold. He was dressed for the weather, which was well below zero. Thankfully, there was no wind and the nearly full moon was high and clear. While Hines walked up the plowed path, the sheriff watched him zip up his policeman's jacket, then his down parka over the jacket. He flipped its hood over his short-cropped gray hair. The sheriff guessed Hines was near retirement. Hope so, anyway. Sheriff, Hines nodded as he came forward. Hines, Goddard said, you know Smith Barnes. Sure, Hines said, nodding at Barnes. The three men were tense in the cold. It wasn't just the weather or the corpse beyond the house and barn. Hines, Defiance's town cop, had long made an effort to keep the sheriff out of Defiance's law enforcement affairs, which was fine by the sheriff, who had the rest of the county to patrol. The sheriff's office was 10 miles east of Defiance in Vermilion Falls. There had been times a crime crossed borders requiring the two men to work together, which neither did well nor enjoyed. From the sheriff's point of view, Hines had never quite passed the smell test, and that was one reason why small town cops were best limited to the narrow confines of their own town's borders, particularly when it was a Minnesota Iron Range town like Defiance. On more than one occasion, the sheriff had received complaints about the graying lawman, but he had been forced to back off when Winthrop interceded. Now that he thought about it, the only thing Goddard appreciated past midnight in cold like this was being rid of that son of a bitch Winthrop, if the reports were true. He would no longer have to worry about pulling his punches with Hines, providing Winthrop hadn't shared their little secret. What made the sheriff edgy was his doubt the dead man had kept his word. That's the introduction. That's the first chapter. But another mystery trope that many people that write mysteries and thrillers abide by is that you don't go more than one or two chapters before introducing your protagonist. And since this protagonist is going to appear in the next 3 Sam Rivers mysteries, I thought it would be good to introduce him here. By the time Sam Rivers arrived at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Office, Judy Rutgers' message had already been broadcast to a half dozen coworkers needing a Monday morning chuckle. Rutgers was a sheep rancher who lived over 2 hours southeast of Denver, Colorado. "This is Judy Rutgers," she blurted. "Last night, one of my ewes was taken, a wolf. I got all the proof you'll need, and I'm sitting here with my rifle, hoping the cocksucker shows its ugly head. When it does, I'll be blowing it off." There was a pause, during which Maureen, the office assistant, said, "Wait, she's not finished." Sam's coworkers paused over Maureen's speakerphone. "I'll give you till sundown to get out of here and look, Rivers. Then I'm setting traps." The line went dead. "Sundown," Maureen repeated, parroting Rutgers' rasp. The office broke into laughter. Sam Rivers' appearance caused his coworkers to fade back to their desks. "Morning, Sam," Maureen nodded. "Maureen," he nodded back. His sallow-rimmed eyes told her all she needed to know about his weekend. She'd keep it to business, but like the rest of the staff, she was waiting for an end to Rivers' depression, or maybe for his transfer back to National Field Operations. "Judy Rutgers has issues again. I heard. What should I tell her?" "Tell her I'll be out afternoon. First, I need to talk with Kay Magdalene, then finish some paperwork." He had received another troubling email he hoped Magdalene could help him track down. The anonymous emails came from a region and a past Sam thought he'd put behind him a long time ago. "Should I see if Kay's in?" "Her Outback's in the lot." Maureen's ears tracked gossip like a pair of Doppler radars, and she had a mouth like a satellite radio, which is why Sam never shared anything with her. Maureen might have been the one to overhear the news about his dog, Charlie. "That's 2 Kay Magdalene visits in less than a week," she said. "You sure you feel okay?" Maureen was fishing. He almost never visited his old supervisors. "Clarence is a Rockies fan," Sam said, "and I have a lead on some tickets." He lied. When she didn't recognize the name, he added, "Clarence is Kay's husband. He and I go way back." Truth is, he and Kay Magdalene had worked together for more than a decade when he was a national field agent, and he had never met Clarence. Maureen nodded. Oh, okay. I'll let Judy know you'll be there this afternoon. Thanks, Maureen. Then he turned and disappeared into his cubicle. Charged with protecting and managing the nation's wildlife, the USFW had taken Sam Rivers, one of its best national field agents, into places no sane person would want to go. That is until a year ago, when his failing marriage and then his failing best friend, his dog Charlie, prompted him to step down from the national spotlight to take a job in local investigations. 5 years earlier, the Denver Post ran a Sunday feature on his work at the USFW, saving endangered species one animal at a time. The article recounted one of his most recent cases. Rare Florida deer were being annihilated from a section of the Florida Keys. Their total disappearance from an area they'd previously inhabited was suspicious. Sam investigated, and after some digging and a few lucky breaks, he discovered a small group of developers who believed concern for the key deer, which the USFW estimated to number around 800 animals, was negatively impacting their development plans. They'd hired a South Florida hunter to rid the proposed development site of any trace of the small endangered deer. And they would have succeeded if the hunter hadn't begun selling key deer skins, hooves, horns, and venison on the black market. The article called Sam Rivers the predator's predator, a moniker that stuck, at least within his office in the USFW. There was a picture of his 6'2" frame standing in front of the South Florida bulldozer he had single-handedly idled. His square shoulders and 195 pounds looked small in front of the huge shovel blade, but his greasy black hair, disheveled undercover clothes, and 4 days beard growth made him look like the swamp rats he'd hunted. The article recounted how before it was all over, Sam had to fight his way out of a backwoods bar. His then wife, Maggie, had been proud of the Denver Post's coverage. She cut out the photo and taped it to their fridge. That's it. Thank you very much again for having me, and I really look forward to hearing from my colleagues.
Thank you very much for that, Cary. I'm excited about 4 books now for Sam. He sounds fascinating. So our next presenter this evening will be Sue Leaf. And Sue has written a bunch of nonfiction in both a more academic context, historical context, and personal, and all of these touch on various aspects of the natural world. And she is last year's winner for the Minnesota Nonfiction Book Award. So welcome, Sue.
No, can you
There you
hear
go.
me?
Yeah,
Well, we're gonna try this.
you're gonna do it. It's gonna be great.
Okay.
Bum, bum.
So let's go back. This is a PowerPoint I put together for a book group. And then the host couldn't make it work. And so I never given it. But I thought it was a good insight into what I write about and how I do it. And I'm confusing matters because I tell people all the time that I'm not the bullhead queen, but then the title is The Bullhead Queen Speaks. So how do I work? People ask me this a lot because I work at home and I don't work for a boss. But I'm very driven. I sit down to work every day usually at 9 o'clock, especially if I am writing, like writing text, writing an essay. And I will work until 1, take a break, and then I can often come back at 4 o'clock and work until 7. I even work at the cabin. Usually that's a little bit less because I don't have internet at the cabin. It's more journaling and kind of loose writing to see what comes up. I have help. Some of you may have heard that sad cat in the background. Here I'm reading proof for the Roberts book, and of course she's in the most important spot in the house. And here I'm plotting a trip through the Boundary Waters for the Winchell book. I have been with a writing group since 1996. We met at the Loft Literary Center. Usually we're not driven to drink, but this is Sue Narayan, who has been in the group since that long. We met at the Loft. And I keep a journal, but I don't keep a journal daily. But when I'm traveling, or if I'm like on a bike trip or a canoe trip that I think I might want to write about, it's a pretty detailed journal. I read a lot, but not as much as I'd like. I've never belonged to a book club because I don't want people telling me what to read. I usually have a long stack of books of things I need to read for what I'm writing about. Often I read archival material. This here is a journal that was written by Newton Winchell when he was a young man. I owe a great deal of thanks to my husband, Tom, when we go on trips, like the canoe trips in Portage. He's the one who decides where we're going to drop in, where we're going to take out. And of course, because it's hard to make it as a writer, he's the one who supports me financially. So where do I get my ideas? And by the way, this is a very young me writing in my journal. And I actually mined this journal just recently for an essay on the South Shore of Lake Superior. Well, I see things differently than a lot of people because I'm not trained as a writer. I'm trained as a biologist. And so here we are in Algonquin Provincial Park, and I'm looking at fall warblers, in particular a flock of palm warblers that had just gone by. But biologists would not claim me because I'm too concerned with ethics, and I'm more interested in individual animals and how they make their way on Earth rather than as populations. And then again, I'm a mother and I worry in certain ways that a lot of writers don't. I worry a lot about climate change. So somewhere between science, religion, motherhood, being active and being reflective, there's a sweet spot that produces tension, and that's good material to write about. So I have produced 5 books that have been published, but they show that they're from the same mind. So here are some of the themes. The books talk about looking for the good life. It's all about making choices. And if you think about the choices you make in your life, everyone's looking for the good life. And in fact, this was an assignment that my husband and I worked on together as seniors in high school. We were in senior social studies together. And the question under consideration was, what is the good life? Another theme is that immersion in nature is life affirming and renewing. And that there's a continuity in nature that's nice to remember. Also, being active is one of the secrets to being well. And I think in the Bullhead Queen, I write a lot about that when I talk about our family's broomball parties or canoe trips. There are educational themes as well. As early as Potato City, I wrote about climate change as being the most severe environmental threat that humans have ever faced, and we are running out of time when we can successfully control its worst effects. And I would maybe argue that we have long been out of time. The time for simple, happy nature writing is over, but a writer can bludgeon her readers with a message. Readers need to be lured into a realization that they love nature. One of my first editors, Ann Regan at the Minnesota Historical Society Press, told me I had to seduce my readers into seeing the world like I do. Then, at least this is what we hope, they will fight to save what they love. I tried for years to avoid carrying this message. I was bummed out by this message as an undergraduate, but when I began to write books, I realized that to write what was most true, I had to write what was most important. But these are the musings of an older woman. That's not how I began. Every book begins with a definite launch, and our year in Owatonna, the first year of our marriage, launched me. Here I am by the railroad track that ran past our house, and many of you must know that the railroads were laid down before the natural environment was destroyed. And so you can find prairie plants along the railroad tracks even today. So here I am out looking for prairie plants. So I had a new husband, a new life, and I was learning to live with a man who works 60 hours a week and still does. So I realized that I was going to have to be responsible for my own life. We didn't know we were looking for the good life, but we did spend our time on rivers. And this is an early scene of the Straight River that goes through Owatonna. And then after that year, a PhD, 4 kids, and a teaching gig in 8 years. And then the local North Branch Library changed my life. I had just quit my teaching job at the community college because I wasn't spending enough time with my kids. And my dean had told me I was going to regret it. And I went past the North Branch Library where we were living, and I found a catalog for the Loft Literary Center. And I thought, a writing class? I'd love to take a writing class. And I got published right away. My first book was Potato City, a tale of loss and redemption trying to understand North Branch. North Branch was once the site of the major potato production in Minnesota, and a well over $1.5 million industry at the turn of the last century. And the best thing about North Branch is it's been so poor that they haven't torn down their old buildings. So I could see, for example, the original bank on the left and the original movie theater on the right. And when we were in town, they were both still functioning as they had been expected to. And that's the Halloween blizzard. Well, I was haunted by the native oak savanna, which looked oddly familiar to me. And then I realized that my childhood home in Roseville, Minnesota was an oak savanna. This is the Helen Allison savanna up by Cedar Creek. We had been to Helen Allison, we realized we could see the oak savanna everywhere. This is our neighborhood in town. And remnant bur oaks and the farm implement dealers. And the prairie grasses. Potato City was about immigrant Swedes, local savanna, potato fields, and restored savanna. When we moved to Center City, we lived and still live on Pioneer Lake, which is not a very high quality lake. It was an inspiration. The inspiration for the metaphor was a boat that my son, my 14-year-old smart alecky son, had built, calling it the Bullhead Queen. And the lake itself proved a metaphor. To the south was Chisago Lake Lutheran Church, which is religion. I remember saying religion. To the north was undeveloped land or wilderness or science. And in my life, the tension between science and religion has always been present. I asked, is there beauty in a modest, abused lake? I asked, who are our neighbors? Are we loving them as ourselves if we consider the lake an entity, a neighbor? How are we treating its shoreline? The book also explores the idea that there's a moral dimension to everything. And then a change of pace, I kind of stumbled into the life of Dr. Thomas Sadler Roberts. And he was the guiding light behind the Bell Museum of Natural History, and no one had written a biography. And I was well suited to write this biography since I'm a bird watcher myself. I really kind of grooved on Dr. Roberts. He was a physician in Minneapolis. He came to Minneapolis in 1867 and immediately began watching birds with his dad, and then kept a detailed bird journal, which was actually in the Bell Museum of Natural History, the old one, their library when I was there as a graduate student, and no one ever knew it. He's the author of The Birds of Minnesota, a 2-volume bird book that will never be equaled. Only Roberts could talk about the abandoned farmhouse on the shores of Lake Calhoun. He was the guiding light behind the Bell Museum of Natural History. This is the diorama you will never see because it did not go over to the new Bell. This is Minnehaha Falls and a river otter. He was the first professor of ornithology in the state at the University of Minnesota. A pioneering wildlife photographer. And because I had to set the stage for him, it's also a natural history of early Minneapolis. This is the land surrounding Cedar Lake. It's Robert's own photo. I needed a change of pace after the Roberts book. I spent a lot of time in the library doing research for the Roberts book. So then I spent more time at my desk at home writing a collection of essays. I thought I was writing a book on telling people where to canoe that weren't the boundary waters, because I think the boundary waters is grossly overused. And here I am contributing to the crowding. And this is when we were in college, we would take trips with 25, 30 people at the end of college. You can't do that anymore. But then the second layer, I realized it was actually a romance between my husband and myself. And the third layer was introducing children to the life of canoeing. And the fourth layer, I realized that we were looking for the good life. In fact, I set the essay on the Osable River in eastern Michigan, where we evaluate each cabin as we were passing it, whether it was a good life or not. So what is the good life? That's the question of the book. Portage relied heavily on simply told stories. For example, the Niobrara River essay in Nebraska. It was a dramatically different place to paddle. That's a sheer outside bend of sand. This was in the Nebraska sandhills. In this essay, there was a relationship drama over a spoiled book that I had, well, depending on who you talk to, I had left carelessly in the canoe. There was issues over public lands. We were on a public waterway, but that's privately owned cattle desecrating the water. And the Niobrara was moving through an ecological crossroads between east and western species of birds and trees. And the ultimate question of the book was, what is the best way to portage from one abyss to the next? Book number 5 was a biography. This is the one that won the Minnesota Book Award last year, on Newton Horace Winchell, a Minnesota geologist from the 1880s. He was actually hired by Dr. Falwell, president of the University of Minnesota, to lead the Geological Survey, which is looking at the different rocks underneath the surface of the state. I really tried not to write this book because I don't have a good geology background. It was a whole new field for me to learn. I asked the question what science can tell us about the nature of life. And I also asked, because I found I became interested in this, what role did the young University of Minnesota play in the intellectual climate of the state? Because Winchell and his wife, who was also a college grad from the 1860s, were part of a group of people that were feminists and people that wanted to see women have the vote. There's Lottie, the college grad, who was also a college professor when he met her. And writing the book involved developing the geological eye. My husband was a geology major for a brief period in college, and he could look at a landscape and talk about moraines and drumlins. And I always admired that and wished I could do it. And now I think after writing this book, I can. This is, by the way, not in the boundary waters. This isn't on the St. Croix River, but it is part of the same system, the Mid-Continental Rift. So those are basalt cliffs. And I have another book in the pike, and I'm thinking about one after that. So still coming.
Thank you so much, Sue. I'm so thrilled to watch threads through a writer's work like that. It's very, I mean, it's fun to do that yourself sometimes, just to be like, what am I not able to walk away from thematically? And I think that's great. Also, you might be my mother's sister separated at birth. I swear, this like natural world, religion, science thing. Yeah. Feel great kinship here. So our third writer this evening is Jonathan Slaght, and I am going to try desperately to not fangirl too much because I love all of these writers, but Jonathan is a writer on the Blackstone's fish owl, and he is a wildlife biologist for the Wildlife Conservation Society as their Russia and Northeast Asia coordinator. And owls of the Eastern Ice hit the world big last year and won the Minnesota Book Award in general nonfiction. So welcome, Jonathan.
Thanks, Wendy. So yeah, first of all, thanks to you and the friends for inviting me to speak here. And also thanks to Sue and Cary. Those are both interesting presentations / readings. I do see that my mom is in attendance, so I have to say hi, Mom. And so my bit here is going to be kind of a hybrid between what Cary and what Sue did. So I'm going to start off with a bit of a presentation and then transition into a bit of a reading. So let's go. Right, so this is the book. It came out in August of 2020. And Sue was actually one of the first people to read it. And she got the advanced copy and was asked to do an interview / review for the outdoor section of the Minneapolis Star Tribune. And she wrote me this nice note saying, this book is going to be big. And of course, I didn't believe her because it's a book. It's just a book about owls. But turned out she was right. And what an owl, right? I mean, these are just remarkable birds. Just there's absolutely enormous. They're about the size of a bald eagle. They stand about as tall as a fire hydrant. They're just enormous, beefy birds. But I think one of the reasons that the book managed to sort of jump the rails from appealing to the bird freaks is that it also was very much a book about people, right? People who share the forest with the owls and rely on the same natural resources that the owls do. And it's also very much a book about the scientific process of identifying a study, designing it, conducting the field work, and then trying to make sense of all the data to develop some kind of a conservation plan. So I'm going to do a reading, but before I get into that, I do want to provide some background. First of all, about the place where the story happens, and then some context to the specifics of the scene. So the story takes place in the Russian Far East in a province called Primoria or Primorsky Krai, which is it's kind of a forgotten part of Russia. Most people have a sense of, oh yeah, European Russia, and then this sort of big Siberia. Not a lot of people know that Russia borders North Korea, and it has a huge border with the Sea of Japan and with China. It's a very mountainous region. Primoria is defined largely by the Sekate-Alin, which are a very long mountain chain reminiscent of the Appalachians in the American East, where it's kind of low and persistent. The beautiful rivers meandering valleys between the mountains and the Sekate-Alin, really good salmon rivers. And then it's stunning coastline. This is the Sea of Japan here. I think people have this idea of a mental image of what Russia looks like, and crystal clear waters and sandy beaches don't always jive with that mental image that people have. There are about 2 million people living in the province of Primoria. It's about 2/3 the size of Minnesota. So, and half of that, 1 million people, are just here in the capital city of Vladivostok, which is in the south. And so as you go further north, the villages really look like this. This is Ternay, which features heavily in the book. There's about 3,000 people that live here, but some of these other settlements, populations can be measured in the hundreds, or in some cases even dozens. This is Amgu, and the scene I'm gonna read from here takes place maybe about 40 minutes drive north of Amgu. This is a logging village of 600 to 800 people, where most people live in these single-story wooden homes. They get their food from the forest, either hunting deer or wild boar, or protein from fish from the rivers, and heat their homes with wood stoves. There are the wildlife in the region are just out of this world, and I could give talks. I do give talks that are just devoted to the wildlife of this region. This is probably the most famous, the Amur tiger, also called the Siberian tiger. Siberian is a bit of a misnomer. There are no tigers in Siberia. They live in the Amur River basin, which is why Amur is a better word for these tigers. And there's brown bears here too. So in fact, this is the only place in the world where you have brown bears and tigers living in the same forests, sharing the same habitat. They do sometimes fight, and they do sometimes kill each other. And of course, then there's fish owls. So sort of the premise of the book here is, there are these pressures on the natural resources of the region, logging, fishing, roads going in. The trouble is that for a species that's endangered, low density, and cryptic like the fish owl, it's hard to really understand how these pressures are impacting the owls. And so the idea behind my PhD study here at the University of Minnesota, which became kind of what the book is, was to find some of these owls, catch them, put GPSs on their backs, and then let them kind of fly around in the wild for a year or so, and then capture them, download the data, and then try to turn that data into predictive models to tell us what parts of the habitat were most important for the owls. What do they need to survive, and how can we make their needs work with the needs of local industries and economies that everyone who lives here is 100% dependent on for their own livelihoods. So that's what it is on paper, but in practice, it's a lot of time outside in the winter. It's just weeks at a time, just being out in the woods, trying to find and catch these birds. And so the way it sort of happens is, you look for a spot that owls are living in. They're territorial birds, so there's a male and a female that occupy the same place year round. So they find some open water where they can actually access fish, and we drive our truck up to it. It's a big transport vehicle. There's almost like a 2-bedroom apartment built onto the back there. And this is a base camp. So you park this somewhere and work out of it, put our traps in the river, trying to catch the owls. But then in some cases, we actually, where we needed to trap birds was too far away from where we could drive to. So we'd also set up a blind, just a tent, and sit in there and trap out of there. And in the passage I'm going to read, we're working on one territory, but we're trying to catch 2 different birds. We're trying to, so we've broken up into 2 groups. One group is at the base camp, and I was in a tent, in the tent with this guy, with Andre Cole. And so you've got your site where the owls are hunting. We put a trap right there. The owls are sort of, they move in at night. They're crepuscular, so they're active mostly dusk and dawn. They fish. Ideally, they get caught in our traps. And we're just sitting nearby in our blind, 20, 30 meters away, kind of surrounded by cables and batteries. You can see there's a little video monitor there on the right. So we have an infrared video camera as close to the capture site as we can, and then kind of snake a cable through the snow to our blind, and then power it there. Then we just sort of sit in there for a while. The trouble at this specific site is that we've actually already captured the male, the resident male, and we captured this bird, which is the young bird, so the daughter of the male that we caught. And we were trying to catch the female, and she was really giving us quite a hard time. So to give you a sense of that, the chapter I'm reading from is called "The Monotony of Failure." The nights dragged on. A deep winter stillness perforated by occasional firecracker-like pops, ice expanding in tree cracks as air temperatures plummeted after sunset. The adult female fish owl was like a ghost. We heard her vocalize with her mate almost every night, but she appeared on screen only once, when she hit our trap but pulled free before we reached her, the only fish owl to ever do so. After that, nothing. She must have maintained a hunting location we had not identified. Based on our experience with other fish owls, could have been kilometers away. We'd been living in the forest for nearly a month, repeating the same actions day after day with little new progress. Tired from our overnight shifts in the blind, Katkov and I would load the heavy 12-volt camera and video monitor batteries into backpacks and haul them to the base camp for charging. Maybe we'd spend the day repairing traps or equipment or wandering the forest for fish owl sign, then return the batteries to the lower blind in time for dusk and to check trap components, then huddle in the tent until morning. The banded juvenile fish owl, a regular visitor to the lower trap, became a source of light among the surrounding monotony and field season fatigue. Specifically, I was captivated by its hunting behavior and looked forward to its arrival outside our blind almost every night. Few people in Russia have seen adult fish owls at the nest or hunting, but the observations of the juvenile were even more unique. These were the first detailed views of a young fish owl learning to hunt on its own. The bird would typically arrive soon after dark. We'd watch it wade in the shallows, illuminated by the invisible infrared lights of our camera as it moved with a slow, cautious swagger. Occasionally, it would rake at the pebbly substrate at the water's edge with its talons, then stare intently at the resulting pit. At first, this behavior baffled me, but later, when I discovered hibernating frogs just buried among the gravel of shallow rivers, I realized that the young fish owl was digging with the hope of dislodging a frog. The graveyard shifts with Katkov were draining. We were bound to each other for 12 hours at a time in a stagnant tent with little forward progress, and he talked incessantly. Eventually, I'd had enough. Look, Katkov, I started. Maybe the female's not coming in because we're talking so much. I think we should stay quiet for a while. Katkov did not agree. There's no way that fish owls can hear us. We're whispering and the river's loud. All the same, I countered, we want to do what's best for the birds. He conceded. He really did want what's best for the owl, but was not happy about it. Every 5 to 10 minutes, he'd blurt out a thought or reminded him of our agreement, and he quieted. The next evening, I approached the blind and was surprised to see that Katkov had erected a thick wall of snow between the river and the tent. He was clearly bored, so I didn't pay much attention and entered the blind, prepared for another night of waiting. As we sat inside and Katkov began filling my head with trivialities, I waited impatiently for the juvenile to appear so I could use it as an excuse for quiet. The second the bird moved downstream, I hushed and pointed. No worries, Katkov said, beaming in the monitor's glow. I built a sound barrier. Suddenly, the wall of snow made terrifying sense. I'm pretty sure they can still hear, I protested weakly. Nope. Katkov was still smiling. Watch. He slapped his hands together as hard as he could. The fish owl on the screen, in reality only 30 meters away, not even flinch. In the low light of the tent, Katkov mistook my grimace for a smile and clenched a fist in victory. All was lost.
Thank you for reading my favorite part. I mean, there's a lot of favorite parts, but I enjoy that part because it gives us a great sense of exactly what you said, that sort of stagnant sitting. And it's something I wondered about as someone who almost went into wildlife bio. Like, what if you don't like your co-researcher? Like what if, and that's all you've got. This is your human companion. And yeah, so thank you for that. That was fantastic.
I would like to add it. I do feel like I throw him, Andrei Katkov, under the bus a little bit to disparage him. But I try to, he's a great guy. He's just not someone I want to live in a tent with for weeks.
Yeah, it's delightful on the page. So I assume you, yeah, but yes, you're just want to be focused on this. You've got this constant background buzz. It's, yeah. So I would like to invite a conversation between our writers this evening and folks in the audience. If you have questions, now is a great time for those as well. But I would also like to start out with one of my own. And I'm, as you're all, writers of nonfiction, and Cary, you also can answer this as someone who does both, but you might begin with a research question, or as Sue said, a tension between things. But all of the books have such a fantastic narrative through line, and I'm wondering what process you go through to sort of tease out what your narrative thread is going to be. Anybody can grab this.
I'll just start. With my book, I mean, it's a PhD project, so there's fairly easy, kind of start, middle, end. But the trouble I had was it was too much like a diary. My chapters started out where I'd wake up, do stuff, go to bed, wake up, do stuff, go to bed. And that's really where my literary agent, my editor, came in handy, kind of helping me smooth out those edges and make it seem like make it appear to be more of a story with a narrative arc than this sort of field journal.
In praise of editors, the more I do these events, the more I goodness, they're fantastic humans. And that was, I'm just going to throw this right back at Jonathan for a second, but I was curious about how much, journaling you had, because the book does have fantastic detail of the environment that you're in. And so how much was it just, how dependent were you on your photos, on the recordings that you were making versus things that you were writing down as you went?
They pretty equally between photos and what I wrote down. I mean, there were always, the book's full of weird things that happen. There are always these weird things happening. And the Russians, my collaborators were so used to these bizarre experiences that it didn't faze them at all. And so I felt like I needed to document some of this stuff. But then also because it was a PhD project, I'm taking pictures of everything. Every field site I go to, 15 pictures, I'm looking north, looking south, east, west. Every cabin I went into, I took pictures of. And so these were all reasonably well curated on a computer. And so when I would look, I'd say, okay, May 10th, I go into Vova Volko's cabin. I can then just look up those photos. There's a picture of Vova Volko's cabin and can describe it as though I'm walking in for the first time. So it's a combination of them.
Thanks. I can throw back to this narrative thread question for Sue or Cary.
Well, I can talk about Portage. I was trying to, when I had all the essays written that I wanted to write, I was trying to decide how to organize it. And, there's several different ways. You could organize it by region, or you could organize it by theme, or you could organize it by chronology. And so I went up to the cabin by myself and spent several days up there just reading the essays through. I believe I took the hard copy. Always have hard copies. I took them and I spent a couple of days shuffling them around and organizing them and reading them through. And that's when the meta themes came to the fore. And I realized that probably chronology, at least loose chronology, was going to be the way to unfold the story. And for a biography, obviously, the narrative is the life. It's kind of, although I did not know with either biography what was going to happen next. I was always surprised when I read through their journals or the ancillary material.
I guess there's something to, I'm curious about the process of retelling someone's life, though. You definitely have, beginning, middle, and end, but you make it, what of yourself then winds up in those spaces?
Well, you choose.
Yeah.
For the Roberts book, there is so much material. You could choose which birding scenes to highlight and which ones to ignore. And I found myself choosing ones that were set in Minneapolis. Like there is one scene where his oldest son comes home from World War I safe, which was not a given in that war. And they go out birding together to where Washburn High School is now. But it was a wood lot. And he has a bird list, so I know what he saw. So that scene just kind of emerged naturally because I was interested in South Minneapolis.
That's very cool. Thank you. Cary?
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm really drawn to story in both nonfiction and fiction. We're very, like the character Sam Rivers that I created in the fiction stuff, he's a wildlife biologist. And that area, we're very similar as writers from attention and interest perspective. The books I write about are usually involved outdoors, wilderness issues. But with regard to story, I always, like for Gunflint Burning, the story of the Ham Lake fire, it almost could be thought of as a thriller. You start from the point of who lights the match, and then you just follow the blaze as it, goes through the Gunflint Trail and up through the Boundary Waters. Similar with my first book, Lost in the Wild, I tell the story of 2 survival instances that happened in northern Minnesota. And there, again, you just started from the very beginning. These people go astray, how does it evolve and all that stuff. And, Wolfkill with the first Sam Rivers mystery, it's kind of more a classic thriller in that readers know who did it from the very beginning. And then you're just racing to unfold the story of the crime and how, even though there were a lot of details in it. But I do find the story is a little more difficult to tell, and Jonathan, you guys have both alluded to this, that it's a little harder to tell in the nonfiction thing, even though you're dealing with real events, you got to figure out what is the narrative arc. And it's not always easy. The book I'm working on now is about the July 4th, 99 blowdown that hit the Boundary Waters. Yeah. And, I've probably interviewed about 75 people. Some of these people, I want to tell their story, but I don't want them to just be hanging out there by themselves. I want them to be part of a narrative arc that goes through, because it's a much more compelling read that way. So it's not always easy. With fiction, you can sit in your kitchen and just kind of, it's a welcome break from talking to people. Although I really do, no, I'm not.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, I really do enjoy the interviews. They're just very time consuming. I got to interview, you record it, you transcribe it, it's a long process. But anyway, I would ask a question. Okay, so Sue, you alluded to you're working on something. I'd love to hear what that next subject is. And Jonathan, I didn't hear you talk about your next book. I'm curious what you're both working on.
Let's let John go.
Okay, I'm not going to tell you. I do have something in the works. I'm just not ready to. I'm in sort of the concept phase. I'm just not ready to kind of get it up there yet.
It's also nonfiction, I presume.
Yes, and soon. I mean, I owe my agent stuff. I just haven't. I'm not ready to. You'll be the
good for you.
Second to know after my mom.
Okay, thank you. No worries. Sue?
Well, I'm working on a book on Lake Superior. And it was kind of derailed by the COVID pandemic, because a lot of what I wanted to do, I couldn't get out to the islands to be there and take notes and experience it, because the Park Service wasn't running, for example. So I'm as we go into the winter and it's harder and harder to be outside and be active, I am going to be casting about for some other topic to write on until the pandemic is over.
Well, I look forward to that. I love Superior. That North Shore is just gorgeous. That I look forward to reading that.
Good.
Yeah, it's exciting. Everybody's got new things floating around.
I have a question for Sue, and I'm not sure I'll be able to articulate it well, but as a biographer, so you're writing, you're digging up, someone's past, right? And you must find a bunch of good stuff, but you must also find some not great stuff about people. And so I'm wondering, how do you, when you find something that's not complimentary, how do you work that into your book? Do you mention it? Do you try to qualify it, or how do you deal with the bad stuff in someone's past?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I didn't find anything really bad with either of these guys. Robert, to compare the two, they knew each other, first of all. Winchell was Robert's professor at the University of Minnesota. Roberts was a more calculating, hold his cards close to his vest type of person. So he kind of self-edited what was remaining for people to read. And in fact, one of his observers who was actually doing waterfowl counts for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service told Roberts that you should write your own biography now before someone else does. And you don't like the result. And I just kind of, when I read that letter, I kind of went, oh my God. I don't know if Roberts would have liked the book or not. Although I'm not into muckraking. I think it's a fair account, but it's not a glorified account, but it's not a nasty account. For Winchell, Winchell was much more, he didn't see himself as having a legacy, and his heart was on his sleeve, which is kind of a more appealing character for in some ways. You know, when he writes the love letters to his wife, when the summer before they got married, are just absolutely unedited. It's just so exciting to read them. You can just feel the heat 150 years after they were written.
Wow.
And I think for both of them, if there was something that was important to be told, that I felt would violate their privacy, but needed to be said, I said it, but that was not very common.
Got a question from the audience for John. She says, your research was conducted several years ago. So how are the fish owls doing, and what's new with your friends in Russia?
Yeah, well, I mean, I haven't been in almost 2 years now, right? Because of the pandemic. The work is continuing, even though I haven't been there. The people described in the book are still doing the work. We kind of came up with these conservation recommendations, which was sort of the end of the last part of my PhD dissertation, and we've been working through those, just kind of trying to work with the logging company to reduce the harm of that industry, and that's been a pretty good, a reasonable partnership. I mean, I think better than many people would think, and the owls are doing okay. I mean, they're not doing great. I mean, overall, I mean, there was a, Sue mentioned climate change, and I mentioned that in the last chapter of the book, there are some climate change issues that have been hurting the gals. And just like here, we're having these once in a century storms every few years, it seems. It's the same things over there. There's this big typhoon that knocked down quite a lot of fish owl habitat, just leveled the trees. This is one territory that Sergei Avdyuk and I went in to check on the territorial repair, see how their nest tree was doing, and not just their tree was gone, the entire old growth patch of forest was gone, because the river had popped its banks and all the rain and the wind, and just cut a swath through the forest and washed all that to the Sea of Japan before receding. So where there was this patch of 300-year-old trees, there was a gravel bar. And there are other issues with, I'm really worried about trophic mismatch, which is where the climate is doing something, and the birds are waiting for cues or doing something just on a different schedule. The example with the owls is they eat a lot of frogs in spring, and frogs, of course, are very sensitive to climate change. If it's a warmer spring, they come out earlier. If it's a colder spring, they come out later. And fish owls seem to time their breeding, so they'll have this young chick who needs a lot of food right when this hyper abundant resource appears with all these frogs all over the place. And I'm worried. There's a big worry that if frogs start coming out regularly too much earlier or much later, the owls are going to miss that and have these chicks starving to death. So I think the owls that we worked with in the book are generally speaking okay, but in general, I think there's a lot of concern.
We're in trouble.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, as you noted, Sue, that time of happy-go-lucky nature writing is no more. But I appreciate the I appreciate being brought along, as you say, on these journeys, because it is important, and it, in the way that we talk a lot about how reading, helps us gain empathy for people that we don't know. I think it can be just as useful to sort of, this is important to consider for all of the things that we share the world with. Yeah, so I appreciate all of that.
I have a question for Cary. In Gunpowder Burning, I want to know what your outline looked like, because oh my gosh, it was so detailed. The narrative was so detailed. So how did you go about setting that up?
Again, that was, what you probably sensed was some floundering. Sounded like you're familiar with a little of that when you write. And what I was really interested in there, I'm drawn to the dramatic instances, and the Ham Lake fire was not the largest forest fire in Minnesota history. It was one of the most devastating in terms of property damage, but it was the only one that was really started by a camper, and which is a tragic story. Somebody starting a fire like Steve Posniak, the guy that started it, did. And so I was really interested at first in knowing that story, how Steve got there. But then once the fire started, then I was interested in telling the story of actually fighting the fire and the growth of the fire and that kind of stuff. Now, I have to say, I think in retrospect, I was ignorant of incident commands and that whole system and how you fight a fire, and how there's this whole system that's been set up to, guide the amount of resources that go into the fighting a fire. And this, of course, was long before those terrible, devastating, talk about climate change, the forest fires that have happened in California, which have been much, much worse than Ham Lake. But they use the same system, and I was ignorant of that. And so I tended to explain some details about, that whole process, probably more ad nauseum than was needed. And in retrospect, I probably should have focused more on telling the actual stories of what transpired. But it's in terms of an outline, it really just sort of followed the fire, telling as many detailed stories of the fighting of the fire by the individuals who were actually doing it when it was happening. But you can tell if you get to the end of it, I really only tell the detail of the first 3 days, first 3 days of the fire. That's when all the damage was done. Then it went into the forest and it burned tens of thousands of acres of forest, but it didn't burn any more structures. And that was the part I wanted to focus on.
I have kind of a fun one for Cary. Maybe when you're working, as you were saying, with the tropes of the mystery or thriller, how do you decide which ones you're gonna cling to and which ones you're just gonna chuck out the window? Because I think there are in the so-called genre fiction world certainly things that readers look for. Markers, I guess. But.
Yeah, it's almost a double-edged sword. You want to honor the tropes, but you want to make it, original and different and kind of compelling and unexpected. I really like fiction that's unexpected. And I really like nonfiction, for that matter, goes in an unexpected direction. So, what really begins to happen, I think, and this is true for a lot of fiction writers, I think, is the characters and the story take it over. And so even though you're telling a mystery or a thriller, and you sort of have a standard structure to go by, there's a body in the first chapter, and then, you usually, and most people introduce the protagonist in the first chapter and maybe a body in the second. But so you honor those things, but you really let the story and the characters, hopefully let it evolve organically.
Thanks. It's helpful. I just, I don't know. It's just one of those things that I wind up wondering about because I do read a lot of mysteries, and I am sort of eyeballing for that's the hand waving. Don't look over here at this character.
Oh yeah, this is the red. That's the red herring. Right. I do the same thing.
Yeah. So I'm always, because the answer is, I think, is probably different for everybody, but I'm always interested in where it shows up. Well, I don't want to keep audience too much because we all have the minimal, I feel like our focus on these Zoom events winds up waning at about the hour. So if there is nothing else from the audience, I will start wrapping us up. But I very, very much appreciate the time that you've spent with us this evening, the writers and our audience. I know you're out there, invisible, beloved audience. So I really do enjoy this. This was the combination of the three of you was something I wanted, and it's the thing I can do from time to time in putting these panels together. Is like, let's talk about nature books for a night. Let's do that.
Nice job.